Bias is not a scandal to be denied, it's a reality to be acknowledged, audited and corrected in public. Every news organisation, every platform, every editor carries prior assumptions about what counts as newsworthy, sympathetic, dangerous, defamatory or simply inconvenient. The sin is not having a bias. The sin is pretending not to have one and then using that supposed neutrality to justify erasing material that contradicts a government line, a corporate sanctions policy, or an internal editorial fashion. So what has come out today is a textbook case. YouTube has removed entire Palestinian human rights channels on the pretext of complying with US sanctions, and in doing so, it's removed hundreds of videos that were not entertainment, not propaganda, but potential evidentiary material about war crimes. That is not content moderation in the ordinary sense. That is the destruction of a public record. Once you cross that line, you're no longer a neutral carrier of speech. You become an actor in the conflict. At the same time, we have the BBC problem. The BBC has always traded on the high reputation that it has for impartiality, which is precisely why internal findings about BBC Arabic minimising Israeli suffering, over-amplifying Hamas-sourced numbers, platforming contributors with openly anti-Semitic material, and then failing to correct in public are so corrosive. If an outlet says we are impartial and then quietly edits, withdraws or buries programmes that turned out not to be partial, or that turned out to be partial, that turned out not to be impartial, the message is not we care about accuracy, the message is we care about reputational control, and that's not journalism either. That is corporate self-preservation. So let's name the principle. In a news environment, deletion is the most aggressive editorial act. Correction is honest, annotating is honest, providing counter-speech is honest, explaining that something is wrong and leaving the original programme up there so that we can see what is wrong is honest. Even age-gating is honest. Deleting because the material is embarrassing to a partner government and awkward for managers, or contrary to a sanctions policy that was itself politically motivated, is simply deceitful. It deprives the audience of the opportunity to see, to judge, to challenge. It also deprives future investigators of evidence. Digital evidence is fragile. If a platform insists on hosting the glossy speech of officials but deletes the phone videos of survivors, it takes sides in the historical record. It's important to stress that none of this is fixed by calling for more censorship in the opposite direction. Once you accept the premise that platforms should remove uncomfortable material because it complicates a preferred narrative, you have accepted the logic that will eventually be used against you. Today it's Palestinian rights groups, tomorrow or yesterday it was Syrian war crimes documentation, wrongly flagged as violence. Tomorrow it can be Israeli hostage testimonies or Russian dissident videos or a documentary that makes a Western government look negligent. The tool is the same, only the target changes. And that is why reflection is more important than suppression. If BBC Arabic framed a Golan Heights rocket attack in a way that minimised Israeli civilian deaths, the honest response is to publish the internal review side by side how the English site and the Arabic site reported the same event and explain what went wrong in the editorial chain. If YouTube pulls 700 videos because of US sanctions, the honest response is to publish a full transparency report that lists each channel, the legal instrument relied on, the appeal route, and where the public can still access the material. Sunlight is not a slogan here, it is the only way to maintain public trust when the subject is mass killing. There's a further hypocrisy that needs to be stated plainly. Platforms claim the volume of uploads makes human review impossible, so they lean on an AI to flag violent or extremist material. Yet these same programs show that they can act with precision and speed when a Western government or an Israeli office or a European commissioner needs a formal notice or sends a formal notice. So volume is not the real constraint. Priority is. Palestinian Arabic Language content from Gaza or the West Bank is subject to hyper-surveillance. Israeli celebratory militarized content is not. That is bias in practice. The BBC case shows a mirror image. Here the problem is not AI, but human editorial culture. Stories that rely heavily on Hamas-sourced casualty figures get prominent play in Arabic. Stories about Israeli hostages do not. Claims about mass graves that were not independently corroborated are run as if they were. Later corrections are slow or hidden. That pattern doesn't require a conspiracy, it only requires a newsroom where some suffering is thought to be ideologically useful and some suffering is not. Again, bias is not the crime. Failing to admit it and failing to balance it, that is the crime. What then is the standard we should defend? 3 things. First, evidentiary tolerance. Material that plausibly records a crime, an atrocity, or a use of force must be preserved, not pulped. If there is a legal reason to restrict it in the US, then mirror it outside the US jurisdiction. If it is too graphic for children, age-gate it, do not erase it. Second, symmetric scrutiny. If BBC English must include Hamas claims with caveats, then BBC Arabic must include Israeli claims with caveats. If YouTube will delete Palestinian human rights content for sanctions compliance, it should be equally ready to delete content that violates its firearms policy, even when the creator is Israeli and commercially attractive. Uneven rules produce political contempt. Third, open argument. You cannot have a democratic information sphere if vital disputes are settled by invisible takedown requests. Let the BBC publish its Gaza coverage audits. Let YouTube publish the exact legal notices it received in full. Let those decisions be challenged by courts, parliaments and civil society. If your editorial decision cannot survive public explanation, it was a bad decision. There's one more stake in which this is important. That erasure benefits perpetrators. When videos of demolished homes, wounded children or dead journalists vanish, it becomes harder to prove intent, harder to trace chains of command, harder to persuade international bodies that the violence was real and systemic. By aligning its enforcement with a US administration that is shielding Israel from ICC, YouTube is not just curating taste, it is shaping what the future will be able to know. That is far beyond the mandate of a private company. So the sober position is this: all channels have bias. That is tolerable. What is intolerable is bias enforced through silence. News requires disagreement in public view. Once deletions start to carry a political pattern, the audience is entitled to say, this is not news. This is a narrative management. A narrative management in the middle of a war in which tens of thousands have died is not a neutral act. It is a moral choice.